In modern society, one of the most contentious and attention-grabbing issues is racism and the abuse of power. Stories of injustice don't just appear in movies. They are painful realities we see in everyday life. We often hear about police officers abusing their power, but one particular story about a cop named Daniels offers a different perspective on the consequences that racism can bring. The image of a powerful, self-assured man who believes he's untouchable symbolizes the authority he's built over many years. Officer Daniels wasn't just any ordinary cop. He was someone who had leveraged his position to harm black people in his city. Meanwhile, the woman he so disdainfully dismissed, someone he saw as weak, was a character whose journey would make everyone pause and reflect. This story isn't just about vengeance or the downfall of one man, but a profound lesson about power, justice, and the change within a system that had gone unchallenged for far too long. We will dive deep into Officer Daniels' journey, from a man who thought his power was invincible to the moment he had to face the consequences of his actions. Alongside this, we'll explore the journey of Renee Carter, a black woman who defied expectations and sparked monumental change. But what happens when justice isn't just represented by an individual, but by an entire system? When instances of power abuse are no longer covered up, and the wrongdoers face the truth? Can the fight against racism and abuse of power lead to real change in a community, or will it fall into obscurity? Renee Carter and Officer Daniels' story is not just a microcosm of change in one institution, but a tale of everyone who faces injustice and strives to make the world a fairer place. What unfolds in the courtroom with a sudden and unexpected shift in power is a critical lesson on how power can be abused and how we can change that. In the next part of this article, we will dive deeper into the key events of the story and extract lessons from the actions of each character, connecting the situations to larger societal issues. Let's look back at what happened with Officer Daniels and Chief Renee Carter to see what we can learn from these situations that might seem impossible to change. As the courtroom filled with murmurs and whispers, Officer Daniels stood with a sense of smug certainty. For years, he had used his badge not just as a symbol of law enforcement, but as a tool to dominate and manipulate the people he was supposed to protect. He had bullied, harassed, and abused his power, particularly targeting black individuals in the city. His unchecked authority had earned him a reputation, one where he believed he was above reproach. In his eyes, no one could touch him. No one could stand in his way. But that belief was about to be shattered in the most dramatic of ways. Renee Carter, who had entered the courtroom that day with quiet confidence, was not just any observer. She was a force, a woman who had faced the systemic barriers of racism and sexism, and had used them as fuel to rise through the ranks of law enforcement. She had seen firsthand how the system worked against people who looked like her, how power often fell into the hands of those who abused it. But Renee wasn't like most people. She didn't accept injustice, she confronted it. Growing up in a city where racial disparities were all too common, Renee knew that if she wanted to bring about change, she would have to do something radical. She couldn't simply stand on the sidelines. Her brother's wrongful arrest at the hands of corrupt officers had been the turning point for her. Watching him get dragged away for something he didn't do, simply because of his skin color, had instilled a deep sense of injustice in her. And she knew that the only way to change the system was from the inside. Renee's journey wasn't easy. She faced ridicule, doubt, and resistance from her colleagues at the police academy and in the department. But she persevered. She overcame the barriers that were meant to keep her out, and eventually, she made history as the city's first black female police chief. In the moment that Officer Daniels first laid eyes on her in the courtroom, he couldn't have known that his world was about to crumble. He dismissed her as just another relative of a defendant, someone who didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. His arrogance, rooted in years of impunity, blinded him to the truth that was right in front of him. When she stood up, his first instinct was to belittle her. He approached her with the same aggression he'd used on so many others, believing that he could intimidate her into submission. What he didn't expect was for her to meet his glare with unwavering calm. And when she told him to remove his hand from her arm, her voice didn't tremble. It wasn't a plea, it was an order. Then came the moment that would forever change the course of events in that courtroom. With one simple gesture, Renee reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge. The room fell silent. Daniel's face drained of color as he staggered back in shock. The badge, gleaming under the harsh courtroom lights, wasn't just any badge. It was the badge of the police chief. "Officer Daniels," Renee announced, her voice calm but unwavering. "I am Chief Renee Carter, and as of this morning, I am your new boss." The silence in the room was palpable. For the first time in his life, Officer Daniels was facing someone who held power over him. His sense of superiority, built on years of unchecked dominance, was shattered in an instant. This wasn't just any black woman in the courtroom. This was the woman who had the power to strip him of everything. In that moment, Daniels stood frozen, his mind scrambling to comprehend the sudden shift in power. The smug confidence he once wore like armor had dissolved. The system that had protected him for so long had just turned its back on him, and the very person he had dismissed as unworthy was now his superior. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension, now buzzed with whispers as the judge prepared to issue a final ruling. But Officer Daniels wasn't just a defendant in this case. He was a symbol of something much larger. The justice system, despite its imperfections, had been holding a mirror up to his actions. And that mirror was now reflecting back the truth that Daniels had been so desperate to avoid. For Renee, this wasn't about personal vendettas or revenge. This was about something far more important: the pursuit of justice. Daniels had become the embodiment of a system that had allowed corruption to fester unchecked, and Renee was determined to dismantle that system, piece by piece. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been victimized by officers like Daniels, for every black individual who had been targeted, harassed, and silenced. The confrontation between Daniels and Renee was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Renee knew that the fight ahead would be difficult, but she was prepared for it. She had spent her entire life fighting against a system designed to hold people like her back, and now she was in a position of power to finally bring change. The fight didn't stop in the courtroom. Outside, the world was watching. Daniels, in a desperate attempt to salvage his career and reputation, began spinning a narrative. He framed himself as a victim of a political hit job, a dedicated cop who had been unfairly targeted. But Renee wasn't backing down. She wasn't just making accusations. She had evidence. In a private meeting with the judge, Renee presented a dossier of complaints, lawsuits, and excessive force reports, all tied to Officer Daniels. It was clear that Daniels had been operating with impunity, protected by a network of powerful allies who had shielded him from accountability. But that protection was no longer in place. The judge, once hesitant, now recognized the weight of the evidence. This wasn't just one isolated case, this was the tip of the iceberg. But the stakes were even higher than that. Renee knew that if she was going to bring Daniels to justice, she needed to uncover the full extent of his crimes. As she dug deeper, she discovered that Daniels had a history of planting evidence, falsifying reports, and covering up murder. One case in particular, the killing of Marcus Avery, a black teenager, had been buried under a mountain of lies and manipulation. But now, Renee had the proof to expose the truth. The more Renee uncovered, the more desperate Daniels became. His world, which had been built on lies and deceit, was rapidly crumbling. In a last-ditch attempt to cover his tracks, Daniels turned to his old network, trying to bury the evidence before it could be made public. But Renee was one step ahead. She knew exactly where to look, and what she found would change everything. In a storage unit on the outskirts of town, Renee's team uncovered the missing pieces of the puzzle: old case files, VHS tapes, and USB drives, all containing evidence of Daniels' crimes. One tape in particular showed Daniels planting a gun on Marcus Avery's body, an act of cold-blooded murder disguised as a justified use of force. The truth was undeniable. The story of Officer Daniels' downfall wasn't just about the end of one corrupt cop's career. It was about a larger reckoning, a reckoning with the system that had allowed such abuse to continue unchecked for so long. Renee wasn't just fighting for one man's accountability. She was fighting for the future, for a world where justice could no longer be bought or manipulated. As Officer Daniels' world began to crumble, the consequences of his actions became impossible to ignore. The carefully constructed lies, the years of abuse, and the powerful connections that had shielded him for so long were finally being torn apart. What once seemed like an impenetrable fortress of impunity was now a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. And at the heart of it all stood Chief Renee Carter, a woman who had been underestimated and dismissed, now the driving force behind the movement for justice and reform. When the news broke, the public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Daniels, once considered untouchable, was now the face of everything wrong with the justice system. The video footage, showing the brutal murder of Marcus Avery and the subsequent cover-up, spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, social media was flooded with outrage. People began to demand accountability, not just from Daniels, but from the entire system that had allowed his actions to go unchecked for so long. For Daniels, the reality of his situation began to sink in. His former colleagues, the very officers who had stood by him and covered for his crimes, were now distancing themselves. The police union, which had been a source of support for him in the past, began to distance itself as well. His friends and allies in high places, the people who had always protected him, were now cutting ties. The very system that had once shielded him was now turning its back on him. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation and avoid the inevitable consequences of his actions, Daniels reached out to his network. He tried to shift the narrative, framing himself as a victim of a political witch hunt. But his attempts were futile. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the public was no longer willing to buy into his story. What was once an ironclad defense had turned to dust, and Daniels found himself standing alone, facing the harsh truth of his past. While Daniels' empire of corruption was falling apart, Renee Carter was stepping into her role as the city's first black female police chief with a sense of purpose and resolve. She knew that exposing Daniels was just the beginning. The real challenge would be dismantling the systems that allowed officers like him to thrive for so long. Renee's investigation didn't stop with Daniels. She worked tirelessly to uncover the deeper issues within the department, bringing to light cases of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct that had been swept under the rug for years. Each new revelation felt like a blow to the integrity of the police force, but Renee remained unwavering in her mission. Her goal wasn't just to take down one bad cop. It was to reform an entire system that had been corrupted by power, privilege, and prejudice. But Renee's fight was not without its challenges. She faced resistance from within the department, as many officers were reluctant to embrace the changes she was pushing. For some of them viewed her as a threat to the status quo, while others were simply afraid of the consequences of confronting the corruption that had been allowed to flourish for decades. Despite this, Renee continued to push forward, knowing that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Her leadership, however, was starting to inspire others. Officers who had once remained silent began to come forward, offering testimony and evidence to support her efforts. The tide was beginning to turn, and Renee's efforts were starting to bear fruit. But the true test of her resolve was yet to come. As the case against Daniels gained national attention, Renee found herself at the center of a media frenzy. Reporters camped outside her office, asking for interviews, seeking her perspective on the unfolding story. But Renee remained focused, determined not to let the noise distract her from the mission at hand. She knew that the media's portrayal of her would be crucial in shaping public perception. If she was seen as just another person seeking revenge, her credibility would be undermined. But if she could position herself as a leader fighting for justice and reform, she could rally support for the changes she was trying to make. Throughout it all, Renee maintained a calm and composed demeanor. She spoke not just about Daniels's individual crimes, but about the systemic issues that had allowed them to occur. She framed the fight against Daniels as part of a larger movement to reform the police force, to hold officers accountable, and to create a justice system that truly served all people, regardless of their race or background. Her message resonated with the public. People began to see her not just as the police chief, but as a symbol of hope, someone who had faced the same injustices that many others had, and who was now in a position to make a real difference. The more Renee spoke out, the more her support grew. Activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens rallied behind her, demanding that the system be held accountable. When Daniels's trial finally began, it was clear that the case against him was ironclad. The body camera footage, the testimonies from victims, the forensic evidence, everything pointed to his guilt. But the trial wasn't just about holding Daniels accountable for his actions. It was about sending a message to the rest of the department and to the city as a whole that abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. Throughout the trial, Renee sat in the front row, watching as the details of Daniels's crimes were laid bare for the world to see. The most powerful moment came when Jamal Brown, one of Daniels's victims, took the stand. His testimony was powerful and emotional, as he spoke about the trauma he had endured at the hands of the very officer who was supposed to protect him. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in applause. It was a moment of victory not just for Jamal, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. Daniels was sentenced to 25 years without parole, a small but significant step toward justice. But Renee knew that this was just the beginning. With Daniels behind bars, Renee turned her attention to the broader issue of police reform. She knew that one officer's downfall wasn't enough to bring about lasting change. The system had to be overhauled from top to bottom. She began working with local lawmakers, community leaders, and other reform-minded individuals to draft new policies aimed at curbing police misconduct and ensuring accountability. It wasn't easy. Many within the department resisted the changes she was pushing for, and some of the city's political leaders were reluctant to implement sweeping reforms. But Renee remained determined. She had seen firsthand how deeply ingrained corruption could be, and she knew that the fight for justice was far from over. Renee's work was far from finished. But in the years to come, her efforts would lead to significant changes within the department. The culture of impunity that had allowed officers like Daniels to flourish was slowly but surely being dismantled. And while the road to reform was long and fraught with obstacles, the seeds of change had been planted. The story of Officer Daniels's fall from grace and Chief Renee Carter's rise to power is more than just a tale of personal redemption. It's a story of systemic change, of confronting the deep-seated issues that have plagued law enforcement for generations. It's a reminder that even the most entrenched systems of power can be challenged, and that justice is not just an ideal, but a fight worth waging. As Renee Carter's journey demonstrates, the path to justice is rarely easy, but it is always worth it. Through her courage, resilience, and unwavering commitment to the truth, she has shown us that change is possible, and that the fight for a fairer, more just society is one we must all take part in. If this story inspired you, don't let it stop here. Hit the like button to show your support for justice, and share this video with your friends and family. By spreading the message, you're helping amplify the voices that demand change. Let's make sure this story reaches as many people as possible. The fight for justice is one we all need to be part of, and together we can make a real difference. So go ahead, like this video, share it far and wide, and don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Together, we can push for change and keep the conversation going.